9:14 a.m. local time. The sky above the Pacific was clear, the kind of hard blue that makes distance look harmless. Camp Redfield, a U.S. Marine Corps installation positioned along the western edge of the island, was already fully awake. Morning PT rotations had ended. Maintenance crews moved between motor pools. Administrative offices were open. The base carried the ordinary rhythm of a forward-deployed force that had learned to live inside tension without reacting to it. Then the radar picture shifted. 14 low-altitude contacts appeared simultaneously on the coastal surveillance feed, emerging from sea clutter less than 60 kilometers out. Their speed was consistent, their spacing deliberate, their altitude, under 300 feet, told its own story. These were not civilian aircraft. They were flying beneath traditional approach corridors, minimizing exposure, using terrain masking off the coastline. Within seconds, identification matrices populated. No transponders, no filed flight plan. Vector direct. The duty air defense officer did not wait for confirmation bias. Multiple rotary contacts, bearing 032, inbound fast. The base did not panic. It transitioned. Across the installation, speakers crackled. The general alarm cut through routine noise like a blade. Marines dropped paperwork. Wrenches hit concrete. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Weapons lockers opened. Quick reaction force teams moved from standby rooms toward pre-assigned defensive sectors. At 9:16, visual confirmation came from a coastal observation tower. 14 transport helicopters, painted in low-visibility gray, flying in staggered assault formation. Twin-engine silhouettes. Heavy lift configuration. The spacing suggested 7 separate landing zones. This was not reconnaissance. This was insertion. Inside one of the lead helicopters, Chinese Special Operations troops sat shoulder to shoulder, weapons locked between their knees. Over 200 personnel distributed across 14 aircraft. Their mission profile had been rehearsed for weeks. Land in multiple sectors, overwhelm local defense before centralized response, destroy key facilities, withdraw before fixed-wing air power could close the distance. The plan depended on compression. 25 minutes. That was the window calculated by planners. 25 minutes to inflict maximum structural damage. Barracks, fuel depot, communications nodes, vehicle storage, command facilities. Enough destruction to broadcast vulnerability. Enough casualties to force political escalation. Enough shock to fracture confidence in the American presence. At 9:17, Camp Redfield's command center was fully manned. The base commander did not shout. Condition 1, weapons free on confirmed hostile landing. The language was simple because the doctrine was not. 7 sectors were activated simultaneously, each pre-mapped, each reinforced with layered defense. Defensive geometry mattered more than numbers, and the numbers were already shifting. The 14 helicopters crossed the outer perimeter at 9:19. They split precisely as expected. 2 aircraft per landing vector, barracks, motor pool, communications tower, fuel storage, armory annex, headquarters building, secondary logistics yard. The choreography was professional. Doors slid open before wheels touched ground. Fast ropes dropped. Assault teams prepared to descend in synchronized waves. From above, it looked overwhelming. From the ground, it looked different. Marines were not scrambling blindly. They were already in position. Rooftop overwatch teams had established sightlines. Machine gun nests covered landing corridors. Anti-armor teams waited inside reinforced structures with clear backblast zones mapped months earlier during defense drills no one believed they would ever need. At 9:20-12, the first helicopter flared into a hover over the motor pool sector. At 9:20-18, the first rocket left a shoulder-fired launcher from the defensive perimeter. It struck center mass beneath the rotor hub. The explosion tore the aircraft sideways before its skids touched concrete. Burning fuel sprayed across asphalt. The fast rope ignited mid-air, cutting the first wave of attackers into smoke and falling debris. Surprise lasted exactly 6 seconds. The remaining 13 helicopters continued their descent. The assault had already committed. Chinese special forces hit the ground under fire in multiple sectors. They moved with discipline, spreading toward pre-assigned targets. Demolition charges were visible, heavy rifles. suppression teams attempting to carve lanes through defensive fire. But what planners had underestimated was distribution. Camp Redfield did not house scattered administrative personnel. It housed an infantry-heavy Marine regiment on rotational readiness status. Over 700 Marines on base. And unlike a city target, every defender understood the layout better than the attacker ever could. At 9:21, Kadena-based U.S. fighters were already airborne. At 9:22, the perimeter gates were sealed. At 9:23, Japanese self-defense units initiated outer cordon support beyond the base boundary. The tide had not yet turned, but it had begun to resist. On the barracks sector, Chinese assault teams reached the exterior wall and attempted forced entry using compact charges. They succeeded in breaching a side access point. They found 30 Marines inside, waiting behind reinforced interior cover. The first close-range firefight lasted less than 40 seconds. On the communications tower sector, 2 helicopters managed partial touchdown. 30 troops deployed successfully. They advanced toward the antenna compound. They were met by interlocking fire from elevated positions that had been pre-sighted during monthly base defense exercises. In the fuel depot zone, snipers began deliberate elimination of demolition carriers before they reached tank structures. By 9:24, 2 additional helicopters had been destroyed on the ground by anti-armor teams. Black smoke rose over 3 sectors, and for the first time since liftoff from the Chinese coast, doubt entered the assault equation. The 25-minute plan had been built around collapse through shock. Instead, it had collided with preparation. The helicopters were still landing. The gunfire was still heavy. Casualties were mounting on both sides, but the Marines were not disorganized. They were compressing. And as the clock moved toward the 5th minute of contact, the question was no longer whether the base would be surprised. It was whether the attackers could survive long enough to matter. 9:24:37 local time. The assault was no longer synchronized. What had begun as a 7-point insertion was now 7 isolated fights. Smoke rose from the motor pool and barracks sectors, thick and black against the clear Okinawan sky. Burning aviation fuel spilled across concrete, igniting abandoned equipment and casting hard shadows over moving figures. The sound profile shifted from coordinated landing chaos to fragmented, overlapping firefights. The plan had depended on momentum. Momentum was gone. At Landing Zone Alpha, near the barracks complex, 34 Chinese Special Operations troops had made ground contact before their helicopter was destroyed. They moved aggressively toward the main structure, firing controlled bursts to suppress windows and rooftops. They expected disorientation. Instead, they encountered geometry. The Marines inside had not clustered in panic. They had distributed into layered interior defense positions. First floor suppression, stairwell denial, rooftop overwatch. Fire was disciplined, short, lethal, overlapping arcs. By 9:25, the Chinese element at Alpha had lost nearly half its strength, attempting to breach reinforced access points. The remaining fighters shifted to flanking maneuvers, trying to encircle the building. They discovered something critical. They were being encircled themselves. Reinforcement squads moved laterally through pre-planned corridors between structures, using hardened walls and vehicle barriers for cover. The defenders were not reacting randomly. They were executing a rehearsed defensive grid. At Landing Zone Bravo, near the communications tower, 2 helicopters had landed successfully before anti-armor teams acquired them. 30 troops had deployed and advanced within 200 meters of the antenna compound. Their objective was simple: sever external communications, isolate the base, create informational paralysis. They did not anticipate redundancy. Camp Redfield's communications infrastructure had distributed nodes and hardened backups. Even as one tower sustained RPG damage, secondary systems activated automatically. By 0926, Bravo sector defenders had repositioned heavy machine guns to elevated maintenance platforms, firing plunging angles into the exposed assault teams below. Mortar teams deployed smoke to obscure attacker sightlines, then shifted to precision fragmentation rounds targeting exposed concentrations. The attackers at Bravo were pinned against a perimeter fence with no extraction option. Above them, something else changed. At 9:27, the first pair of US F-15 fighters entered the battle space at altitude. They did not immediately fire, they circled, because what remained airborne was still a threat. 6 helicopters were either attempting emergency liftoff or hovering uncertainly above landing zones. Their pilots faced a new calculation: remain to support ground teams and risk immediate destruction, or disengage and abandon the assault. At landing zone, Charlie, near the command facility, the fight was closer. Chinese assault teams had reached the outer administrative structure and detonated 2 small breaching charges. They forced entry into a secondary corridor. Inside, they encountered close-quarters resistance measured in feet, not yards. Gunfire echoed in compressed bursts. Grenades detonated against reinforced walls. Flashbang concussions shook ceiling tiles loose. But every corridor inside the command building had been mapped for defense. The attackers had maps. The defenders had muscle memory. By 9:28, Charlie Sector attackers were reduced to scattered elements attempting to hold interior choke points. They had achieved entry. They had not achieved control. At Landing Zone Delta, near the fuel storage area, the engagement was brutally efficient. Sniper teams positioned on warehouse roofs eliminated demolition carriers before they reached tank structures. One Chinese squad managed to plant a charge against an auxiliary pipeline, but it detonated prematurely under fire, causing localized damage without triggering a catastrophic chain reaction. The Marines defending Delta did not countercharge recklessly. They tightened. Fire lanes narrowed. Movement corridors closed. The attackers' radius of maneuver shrank minute by minute. At 9:29, the first air-to-air missile launched. An F-15 pilot, cleared by Regional Command Authority, fired an AIM-120 at a helicopter attempting to climb out of the Foxtrot sector. The missile struck cleanly. The aircraft disintegrated mid-ascent, debris scattering across the outer edge of the base perimeter. That was the turning point. Until that moment, the assault retained theoretical extraction capability. With one missile, that theory collapsed. The remaining airborne helicopters broke formation. 2 attempted low-level escape toward open water. One was destroyed by a second missile within seconds. Another absorbed heavy ground fire as it tried to climb, trailing smoke as it veered east. On the ground, Chinese assault leaders realized what the sky now confirmed. There would be no retrieval, no second wave, no air cover. The 25-minute window had narrowed to survival. At 9:30, exactly 10 minutes after first touchdown, the battle had transformed from offensive operation to attritional containment. Marine reinforcements continued flowing from interior barracks and training facilities. Every defender who could carry a rifle was already inside the defensive grid. 7 landing zones were no longer 7 fronts. They were 7 traps. At Echo Sector, near the Armory Annex, Chinese troops made a final coordinated push towards secured weapons storage. They deployed suppressive fire and attempted rapid movement across open ground. They crossed into a pre-sighted kill corridor. 2 AT-4 rockets fired in sequence into grounded helicopters used as improvised cover. The resulting explosions eliminated both the aircraft and the majority of the assault team sheltering behind them. The shockwave rippled across adjacent sectors. By 9:31, the attackers were no longer advancing anywhere. They were holding fragments of ground under increasing pressure. The Marines did not rush to finish the fight. They compressed it, sector by sector, yard by yard. Above the base, F-15As maintained overwatch while additional aircraft scrambled from regional installations. Japanese self-defense units tightened the external cordon, ensuring no ground element could escape beyond the perimeter fence. At 9:32, radio intercepts captured fragmented Mandarin transmissions. Urgent, disorganized, requests for extraction that would never come. The tide had not flipped in a dramatic surge. It had shifted gradually, mathematically. 7 landing zones, 14 helicopters, over 200 attackers. Against a base that had rehearsed this scenario more times than anyone believed necessary. By minute 12 of the engagement, one truth was clear. The assault had achieved entry. It had not achieved dominance. And in a fight defined by sustainment, dominance, not surprise, determines who walks away. 9:33:14 local time. The assault had stalled. What remained was compression. Across all 7 landing zones, Chinese special operations elements were no longer maneuvering as coordinated assault teams. They were reduced to clusters, 5 here, 8 there, pinned behind wreckage, burning rotor assemblies, shattered concrete barriers. The original doctrine had depended on speed and simultaneous shock. Shock lasts seconds. Structure lasts longer. At Landing Zone Alpha, the remaining attackers attempted a breakout toward the motor pool perimeter, likely seeking vehicles for mobility or concealment. They moved in a tight wedge, firing suppressive bursts toward barracks windows. They were met with intersecting fire from two directions. Marines had already repositioned to block lateral escape corridors. Elevated firing positions along the vehicle depot created overlapping arcs that turned open pavement into lethal geometry. Within 90 seconds, the breakout attempt collapsed. At Bravo Sector, near the communications compound, 3 Chinese soldiers managed to reach the tower base and attach demolition charges to an external junction panel. The explosion severed primary lines. For 4 seconds, internal monitors flickered. Then backup systems activated. Hardened secondary nodes routed through redundant infrastructure, restored full operational connectivity. The base command net never went offline. The attackers had assumed linear failure. They were fighting a network built for redundancy. By 9:35, the Marines initiated what doctrine defines as counter-isolation. Instead of chasing fleeing elements across open terrain, defenders sealed perimeter sectors and reduced interior pockets systematically. Fire teams advanced in coordinated bounds, always under cover, always with flanking support. No gaps, no overextension. At Charlie Sector, inside the administrative structure, the final interior holdout attempted to barricade a stairwell leading toward a sensitive operations wing. The Marines did not storm blindly. They deployed flash suppression, then cleared step by step, weapon lights cutting through lingering smoke. Close quarters engagements ended quickly. The defenders were not improvising. They were executing practiced muscle memory. At 9:36, 2 remaining helicopters that had hovered indecisively near Delta Sector attempted simultaneous low-level escape toward open water. They did not clear the perimeter. An F-15 locked, fired. 1 helicopter detonated mid-climb, breaking apart over the coastline. The second descended sharply, attempting terrain masking over coastal structures. It absorbed ground fire from defensive positions and disappeared below radar altitude heading east. Whether it would reach friendly airspace remained uncertain. What was certain was this: air support was gone. On the ground, the psychological axis shifted visibly. Chinese teams that had advanced aggressively now consolidated defensively. Ammunition expenditure rates increased sharply. Radio transmissions became fragmented, overlapping, urgent. Some attempted to reposition toward interior storage buildings, possibly searching for fortified space to hold. They found those structures already defended. At Echo and Foxtrot sectors, Marines began sector sweeps, moving behind armored vehicles and hardened walls to clear isolated shooters. Each movement was covered by Overwatch, every angle addressed before advancement. There was no heroics, there was arithmetic. 200 attackers distributed across 7 zones, 800 defenders inside a hardened grid. Every minute increased defender advantage. At 9:38, exactly 18 minutes after touchdown, the engagement crossed its tipping point. No Chinese element retained initiative. No landing zone retained contested dominance. All that remained were shrinking pockets under mounting pressure. At Delta, the last demolition team attempted to reach a secondary fuel conduit line. They were eliminated before closing distance. At Bravo, surviving attackers tried to regroup inside a maintenance garage. Marines sealed both exits and forced surrender through controlled fire and flash suppression. At Alpha, isolated fighters fired from behind a burning helicopter frame until ammunition was exhausted. At 9:40, Marine commanders across sectors reported identical assessments. Hostiles contained, no coordinated maneuver observed. The tide had turned fully. The assault that was designed to overwhelm had become trapped within its own footprint. Above the base, additional U.S. aircraft established air dominance layers, while maritime patrol units expanded coastal surveillance for potential secondary threats. No reinforcements were coming for the attackers. No extraction corridor existed. At 9:42, Japanese self-defense forces completed external perimeter lockdown. Any theoretical ground escape route was sealed. Inside the base, the remaining firefights diminished from bursts to isolated shots. The Marines did not rush to finish the battle, they compressed it. At 9:43, the final organized resistance at Charlie Sector ended when the last coordinated cell attempted one desperate push toward the communications bunker. They were stopped within meters. By 9:44, 24 minutes after initial contact, only scattered shooters remained. No structure, no cohesion. The helicopters were destroyed or gone. The initial shock had evaporated. What remained was inevitability. At 9:45, command transmitted a single directive across all sectors: clear and secure. The difference between assault and annihilation is sustainment. By minute 25, sustainment belonged entirely to the defenders. The strike had been bold, the response had been disciplined, and in modern base defense, discipline wins. 9:46 local time. The last coordinated gunfire stopped. What remained were isolated shots, single rifles discharging from behind shattered walls, behind overturned vehicles, behind burning airframes that no longer offered real protection. The assault had lasted 26 minutes. The turning point had come at 18. The final collapse began at 23. Now it was containment. Across the base, Marine platoon leaders reported sector status in clipped, controlled transmissions. Alpha secure. Bravo clear. Charlie interior swept. Delta hostile neutralized. Echo controlled. Foxtrot stable. Golf under containment. No cheering, no celebration, just confirmation. At 9:48, 2 remaining Chinese soldiers emerged from behind a damaged logistics truck at landing zone Foxtrot. Weapons dropped, hands raised. They were immediately disarmed, restrained, and removed from the engagement area. They were the first to surrender. They would be the last. Elsewhere, small pockets continued fighting until ammunition ran dry or wounds made resistance impossible. The Marines advanced methodically, never abandoning cover, never clustering, never exposing unnecessary risk. This was not revenge. It was procedure. At 9:49, aerial surveillance confirmed no additional inbound aircraft from Chinese airspace. Radar sweeps remained clear beyond routine civilian traffic corridors. The strike had been singular. There would be no second wave. By 9:50, explosive ordnance teams began controlled sweeps of each landing zone. Demolition charges that had not detonated were disarmed in place. Unexploded RPG rounds were tagged and secured. Fire suppression teams extinguished the last active flames near the vehicle depot. Smoke still hung low across sections of the base, but visibility improved with each passing minute. The damage assessment began immediately. 3 primary structures sustained external damage from rocket impacts. 1 communications relay mast required replacement, but had successfully transferred operations to redundant nodes within seconds of impact. Fuel storage remained intact. Armory untouched. Command center operational throughout. The attackers had inflicted damage. They had not achieved systemic disruption. At 9:51, exactly 31 minutes after the first helicopter doors opened, Base Command logged the engagement as tactically concluded. Total Chinese personnel inserted, 196. Estimated killed in action, 188. Captured, 8. 14 helicopters confirmed, destroyed, some by ground fire, others by air-to-air engagement. No aircraft successfully extracted assault teams. American casualties were recorded in sober detail. 19 Marines killed in action. 43 wounded, several critically. Those numbers mattered. Victory does not erase loss. By 9:54, Japanese Self-Defense Forces units entered coordinated perimeter positions outside the base, reinforcing outer security and assisting with airspace control. Alliance coordination had functioned without hesitation. The strategic message extended beyond the firefight. At 10:02, regional command elements received a consolidated brief. 14 helicopters launched, 7 landing sectors engaged. Strike neutralized within 25 minutes. Base fully combat capable. No critical infrastructure compromised. The assault had been designed to create shock footage, international panic, and political leverage. Instead, it produced a different outcome. It demonstrated that speed without depth fails. By 10:10, Cleanup operations replaced combat posture. Bodies were documented and removed under armed supervision. Weapons were cataloged. Intelligence teams photographed equipment markings, serial numbers, communication devices. Every detail would be analyzed. The Marines resumed sector rotations by midday. Rifle magazines were replenished, positions re-established. The base did not evacuate. It did not shut down. It did not alter mission tempo. At 10:22, flight activity resumed overhead as U.S. aircraft conducted visible patrol arcs along the coastline. The message was deliberate. Presence continues. At 10:37, satellite imagery showed smoke columns rising from multiple destroyed helicopters within the base perimeter. Across the region, analysts began recalculating. The planners of the assault had counted on surprise, speed, and psychological shock. They had not fully accounted for layered readiness, alliance integration, and sector redundancy. 25 minutes had been enough to decide the tactical outcome, but the strategic consequence would extend far longer. By noon, international media outlets began reporting hostile helicopter incursion repelled. Language varied, narratives shifted, statements were issued. Inside the base, none of that mattered. What mattered was this: 14 helicopters launched an assault on a prepared Marine installation. Within 25 minutes, the attackers lost initiative. Within 31 minutes, they lost the fight. The base remained operational. The defenders held. The tide had turned not because of emotion, but because of structure. In modern warfare, surprise creates opportunity. Sustainment determines survival. And on that morning, sustainment belonged to the side that never lost control of its grid. The final entry in the operational log was simple: base secure, mission continues. The tide had turned. It had not turned back.